That's initially why I had done it. So that way, there's a couple of us who have Great, and then once that's done, it'll save automatically.
It's recording. Okay.
Perfect. All right, awesome.
So we are in the last 4 chapters of part 3, which is Gail Wyman. And I really thought was interesting was the opening session with the artists. What is the name of that committee? The Writers Committee?
Council of Writers.
The Council of Writers.
Yes.
So what did you think of the characters?
It was, I thought it was largely parodical in the sense that she was sending up writers. It might have been some reference to contemporary writers at that time or playwrights, but it was like a group of postmodernists. I mean, all the sentences were like in the opening of the play were completely discontinuous, concept undermining. She made a reference to a play, the title, which was No Skin Off Your Ass. And I had to think it was a send-up of Thornton Wilder's play, and I forget the title to it. But she was, and Samuel Beckett, you know, was being sent up as well. And I thought it was almost laugh out loud funny.
Right, right. Gertrude Stein.
Oh God, yes, Gertrude Stein, absolutely.
And also the greatest author of the 20th century. He's slipping my mind. Huh?
James Joyce.
James Joyce.
Or, yeah, right.
That chapter with no punctuation. I remember going
yes, an experiment that failed.
Yes.
In fact, J.G. Ballard said that he was influenced by James Joyce, and he said it did me absolutely no good. He said.
Have any thoughts about their? I noticed that some of them were not very smart, and others were very aware of what they were doing.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Michael. I noticed that too. Jules Fogler is in it. I noticed he's the only one who seems to get what Tui's doing. I mean, the others are drinking, you know, from Tui's cup. But Fogler knows that this is, he has some sense of that, of the malice behind it, of the destructive intent. When you said, where is it? He says that 470. Yeah, on 460. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm using an older version. Anyway, at one point he says, what I like, this is Fogler, is what I like about you, Ellsworth, is that it's never necessary to explain myself to you.
Right.
And he also, I mean, it's Fogler who, before Tui gives his explanation of what the goal of all this is, it's Fogler who says, you know, if you want people to stop admiring Ibsen, don't attack Ibsen. Just praise someone vastly inferior. Praise garbage.
Patrick, what did you think?
Um,
Because you're reading this for the first time, right?
Yeah, so there's two parts to this section of the book. I mean, you mentioned the Writers Guild. I think there's also um, the play where Dominique takes Gail to it, the No Skin Off My Nose play. So I was thinking about this. Rand wasn't around enough to really see the cultural decay of like reality television. But there's a passage in the book where it almost jumps out, like that she's sort of hinting at like this is the natural progression of this way of appealing to groups of people, and then I think that the writers represent maybe more sophisticated techniques of appealing to people, and it's not as crude because it might be attacking a particular element of art or music or philosophy. The reason is kind of it's still the reason that they're attacking it doesn't have virtue, like it's to tear it down or it's not to achieve something. It's kind of going backwards and forwards in a group that doesn't possess real experts on the subject matter. So I mean, it's funny, we're in the talking head format, but you see this on news all the time. It's like there's sort of devil's advocate and people are using emotionally persuasive language to argue a weaker position. And there's all these, typically you see it with things like ad hominems, but for ideas, it requires, I think, broader understanding to really know if someone is offering something of value in that type of discussion, or if they're really, diverting the group from learning about architecture or writing in their exam.
I kept thinking of Derrida and Roland Barthes in that whole thing is kind of postmodernist talk, which meaningless, but at the same time dangerous. And I'm not sure how much of what she was lampooning she actually saw or read herself, but yeah, I think you're right on that. I think that was what was going on, and that makes it very funny, but at the same time it's also a little frightening because it sort of reinforces Tui's role in this as a way of basically trying to deconstruct or demote the importance of art, like architecture.
I think there's also
it's kind of
Marilyn?
it's kind of interesting here. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Marilyn.
I was going to say there's some really bad reasoning going on too. I think deliberately, but the idea that, all right, so you're not exceptional, like Ibsen, let's say, and the point about being exceptional is that not everybody is, right? Well, that's understood. But then so that Tui's reasoning and Fugler's, however it's pronounced, is that if you're not exceptional, well, then you're a complete non-entity, right? So there's this either or reasoning going on, and then there's the envy of the non-entities. But I don't think that's. Of course, it's not true, and Rand wouldn't have thought it was true. Because in a free society, people would be able to produce to their abilities. They might not be Ibsen, but they can do other things. And someone like Ike should have been discouraged, obviously, from playwriting, but been able to go into some line of work where he could actually be an honest person. But Tui and Fugler are setting up this this either or situation, and then by saying, well, we'll just take down the exceptional people. It's just very bad reason.
Adele, what did you think of that, the injustice or the justice of these people talking at the group meeting?
I thought it was interesting that Gus Webb was there, an architect who doesn't really belong there. And I think it's because he's Tui's real friend and he knows what Tui is doing. And it was interesting seeing him throughout the scene saying, like, shut up, basically, like, stop talking about this. Maybe they'll catch on. They're stupid, but maybe they're not so stupid. Talking about it, they won't see what you're doing.
Mm.
I keep coming back to that one little description of Ike. That it was the playwright, and he said, he looked at the audience, his mouth smiling in self-mockery, his eyebrows raised insolently, but his eyes pleading. And I think that shadows the physiological, emotional content of several of these people, but they all have eyes, they're insolent, and they're self-mockery. The portrait is
it also points or alludes to a certain amount of cronyism, that these people are all like-minded and, as you say, look to each other for reassurance. I'm thinking of a real life reference for this in Hollywood, where Robert Altman, the late director, who Rex Reed, for example, made this point on TV many times, to say he couldn't understand because all Altman did was turn the camera on and let it run. And then there were a certain number of critics who were like his drinking buddies. And they would almost always say, oh, this is the greatest thing since, the Rite of Spring. And someone actually did say that. I think it was Pauline Kael or someone like that. And Reed just didn't understand. And his films were just awful. They were almost like anti-movies. Anyway.
Right. One of the highlights for me was the concept.
Yeah.
To take down a genius or to take down Michelangelo,
yeah,
you present crap as great art.
Yes.
That was a theme running through them all discussing it. And some of them understood what the motivation was, and the other ones were you mean like I can be as great as Michelangelo? And they would get excited that he would, even though they kind of Huey and Folger were kind of like, well, you're not very smart. That's why you're such a genius. But the guy, I don't quite get this, but I'll just keep writing. For me, that resonated in a huge way of what to look out for people when they're praising crap. Motive. It's not the crap motive. It's something else going on. And I found that a very true element of con artists in real life.
Yes.
In real life, and people praising just crap, and you just watch them.
Right.
Like, making this person tick. And what I appreciate with Ayn Rand is that she flagged that concept for me, which was very helpful in the artwork.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, we should also note that the quasi justification or moral case that is given for it. This is again Togler. What achievement is there for a critic in praising a good play? None whatever. Their critic is then nothing but a kind of glorified messenger boy between author and public. What's in it? What's in that for me? I'm sick of it. What do you? I mean, this is a very close to an explicit statement of what Rand later called the hatred of the good for being the good. I mean, in Atlas Shrugged, there are many passages where, for example, Lillian Reardon says, the greatest love is not to admire virtue. That's only just. It's admiring vice. I mean, it was one of her many formulations of that point. So it's it's an explicit inversion of justice.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just, a motive of tearing down. It's backed up by this really, really corrupt philosophical, if you will, point.
That's a really good point. Again, a reference to film. There's, you may have heard of the Criterion Collection of DVDs, movies that are considered to be important or influential or otherwise masterpieces. And my local Barnes & Noble, it's expanded just in the last few years from like about maybe 50 to 1,000. And so many of them are garbage, including a monster movie. And this is like one of the low points, a monster movie that was influential in George Lucas's career. Hello. I mean, it was just ridiculous. And it's an emasculation of standards. And partly, I think, to make it more demonic. In other words, to have more people say, well, I can see Dazed and Confused as a kind of masterpiece. And it makes it more popular. And that's what they want. They want to be popular rather than hold the line. And I think this is true with a number of critics who deliberately go out of their way to praise stuff that just is worthless. And they're willing to, they'd rather be popular than hold the line and be right.
Well, so what's nice is that Rand is really thumbing her nose.
She saw this. She saw this very, very clearly.
Nailed it.
Absolutely.
Concept.
Yeah.
And very well. We have to move on.
Yeah.
So, Stonehenge was the last contract signed by the firm of Franklin and Keating. Franklin and Keating.
Mm-hmm.
This chapter ends with the Stone Ridge commission that Winan gave to Keating, and Keating is so tired that he doesn't have the energy to design it. And
yes,
you see he talks a little bit like Huey makes the shift to modern architecture. But it's the box-like stuff. It's not Frank Lloyd Wright. It's just a box with holes cut out. And then you can see Keating adapting. So both Franklin and Keating, as the more they work, the more they become exhausted and tired. What's going on here? What's going on with Keating being tired? And one of his greatest commissions comes in. What's happening to him?
Well, he's never been particularly creative. He's basically ripping off, other people and putting his name to it. And it's all about being accepted by society. And I think it's his ex-father-in-law, maybe very much of the same cloth.
Mm-hmm. Adele, what do you think?
Yeah, they reached the pinnacle of their career, and he has nothing more to offer to the world. He has nothing of his own.
Right. Patrick?
I think that it's a criticism of a life lived not according to your own aspirations. And then there's the the scene where he later brings paintings to Rourke's apartment, And Rourke says like it's too late, and that's like the arc for Peter. So they're showing this at the start of life. Peter is racing ahead, and it looks like he is achieving all sorts of success, fortune, fame. He has all the trophies, but internally he's not satisfied, and his spark is going out, right? Like, so instead of looking back on all these commissions and buildings that he's built and feeling proud of them, proud of his legacy, it's like, I was thinking about this a little bit, because he was always copying older styles and reproducing older things, like bank buildings need to look like Roman buildings for some reason, right? I actually think that's kind of a funny observation. A lot of them do look like that. He never did anything original, and probably didn't have it in him the way that the other architects even earlier in the book did, when they all at least had their own style, right? And it's possibly somewhat related to the fact that his audience is changing. Like, as the attention moves to other architects, he really doesn't know what to do. And I think he cultivates that audience. And there's a very big difference there. Like, Rourke's audience is himself. And I think maybe to some extent also understanding that if you're going to be a creative, or you're going to do work that you're really passionate about, that you're going to get criticized and you're going to be misunderstood, and everyone's a critic, right? Classic saying.
Yeah.
And people are going to even tell you like that you're wrong, your ideas are wrong, and it might be decades later, right, when people really recognize what you're doing and that your work is good.
Right.
And so I think it's great that the book has this span of their careers where they're like young men and they grow up together, and then they're older, and they're sort of in their midlife sort of prime. I think they're like in 39 or something around this time. And they've diverged. And so I think that it's really interesting that the book was written that way, and we do get to see what happens with each character's philosophy over time, like what direction does it take them. And
I want to move on, but I had one question for everyone. Does that feel realistic? Not investing in what you know to be true, like as an architect, and then finding out later in life that it was all for naught. You don't feel pride, you don't feel enthusiasm, you're not excited about the next project. Does that come across as realistic about human nature?
I thought so.
Yeah,
I thought it's kind of like a midlife crisis, so to speak.
Right.
When only intensified. That so-called midlife crisis can happen for any number of reasons, but in Keating's case, it's for the reasons people have been saying. That he's won all the awards and finds that they don't mean anything to him anymore. But there's two things.
Go ahead.
If I could just throw in two things here, and I don't want to keep us from moving on, but in this chapter, there are two actual moments of authenticity in Keating, very subtle, I think. But when he comes to the meeting of Tui's group, the dynamic and the atmosphere changes, and he feels elevated. He's not in on the joke or not in on the destructive aspect. and they recognize that, and they, you know, they sit up straighter till he gets in a chair off the floor. Just, that is in some ways a moment of authenticity on Keating's part. You know, not a very admirable one, but and then at the end, the reason he doesn't go to the party is that he's gone off to the country, walking down a country road. What's he doing? We know from later he's out painting.
Mm-hmm.
This is so. You know, we don't know that at this point in the novel, so to speak, but that has to be what's going on.
Right.
So there is something, but it's just not. His life hasn't worked. But there's some remnant, some little ember in there that I think he's trying to rescue. Anyway, that's all.
Well, one of the reasons why I brought up the realism was that Rand calls herself a romantic realist.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was an interesting example of her insights into human characteristics are realistic.
Yeah.
Tries to put things in a very grand, romantic fashion, but at the same time, not be fanciful about human character, not just to be over the top. Like, this person's evil and horrible and everything else, and then they turn out to be a really good guy overnight after they meet the woman of their dreams.
Well, yeah, I think the realism is in looking at the different premises that the characters operate under and following the logic of that to where they lead in each case. In the case of Keating, it was, you know, you'd do anything to be popular and to be liked. And to the point of sacrificing what was from the beginning something that he really wanted, which was painting, and told himself, or someone told him, just don't do that. You're never going to make it that way.
Right. Okay, so moving on now, we get to Wynand and Dominique. And they have their marriage.
What's that big grin for, Michael?
They're like, they're comrades and enemies at the same time. And they have really intense moments of coming together with understanding. And I found that very well written with very complex characters. Because they're like two peas in a pod that express it in a different way. So it seems, you know, like a symphonic orchestra having themes played out, and one's played out on the flute, sounds totally different than when it's by the French horn. It like takes on different characters. And so I really found this whole period, it helps. We get to see how Dominique is propelled in a different direction than Wynand by how closely they're authentic with each other. They're both very honest. So what did you guys find outstanding about their relationship? Before getting married, going on their trips?
One thing I noticed, and it's really a question. Dominique, up until this point, has been, in effect, trying to punish herself to squelch that part of her that loves Rourke, loves his buildings, looks upward with reverence. But with Wynand, she's trying to destroy him too. She's torturing him. She admits it.
Oh, yeah.
Now, why? Why is she doing that?
Into that play.
Unless, yeah, exactly.
Wynand says, you wouldn't torture me if you didn't care for me just a little bit. Right? So
yeah.
that seems
right.
to be the logic.
That's you know, parts slipping in.
Oh, I don't know. I honestly, I have no idea.
I'm not gonna go there.
You must like me some. Otherwise, you would have just, you wouldn't be, you wouldn't. The wedding with,
Yeah.
when she makes him, he wants the quiet wedding, but she makes him have the whole thing. But then he puts it on blackout, right?
Right.
So I have a
And that when she finds that out, it lifts a switch in her.
Right.
Yeah.
She finds out that he wouldn't allow his papers to cover it. She felt honored. She was really, this guy's
Yeah.
got more going on than I thought.
Right. So there is some real affection between the two of them.
And Adele, you love Dominique, so tell us about this with her relationship with Mike.
I just think that they're very, very similar people. It's like they talk about when they're talking about integrity and how much Dominique loves it and how much Gail despises it, even though he really loves it too. They just go about it in different ways, and that's the attraction between them. And when she's torturing him, it's like she's torturing herself, because this could have been her if she had been slightly different.
Also, it's possible he's just a little bit closer to Rourke. And I think that's one thing that she gets, is that when with Keating, there would have been no point. But Winan has some qualities that Rourke has, though not all of them. So I think, because eventually she does find herself thinking a lot more about Rourke.
Yeah.
That line
do.
that
Yeah.
that line that when Winan says the pain only goes down so far,
Yeah.
so deep,
Yeah.
and she loses it completely for a moment there, because
Right.
it was Rourke's line after Stoddard, the Stoddard Temple.
Right.
Yeah, it's kind of a stoic attitude in the face of, in the face of adversity and hostility. Winans used to being hated, and he almost expects it, and it doesn't matter, because the sight of the buildings, the things that he can, the power and so forth, this is what matters to him, so that he can pay for works of art like Dominique. I mean, he sees her as being basically someone who lives up to her likeness in the Stoddard Temple, and appreciates her in the same way that someone would appreciate a great work of art.
So it's a little bit like the ends justifies the means, though.
Exactly.
Beautiful things
Exactly.
he wants beautiful much, and then whatever he gets it is fine. By trashing the Scholar Temple, which is like the hypocrisy surfaces there. That's also the same.
I think that Winan's an admirable character. Do you? You do?
You what?
I don't think Winan's an admirable character. Am I missing something?
Great character for literature.
Right. Well, he's an interesting character, but as in terms of a character to be admired or emulated.
No, I don't think he's an admirable character at all. But he does have some almost redeeming qualities, and there are some correspondent traits to Rourke, which are directed in a negative way, like the pursuit of power.
Well, but the same thing could be said of Dominique.
Yeah. I mean,
Yes,
I think they both have the
agree.
potential to be like Rourke, but they won't for various reasons. Because they're afraid to, unwilling to. They seem to have the ability to.
Yeah.
In the next chapter, in chapter 8, there's a description of Winan. He said he did not hesitate to open her mail. Winan's talking. It's not Winan talking. It's about him opening Dominique's mail after they were married.
Well, he won't even let
Wasn't
her out of the house.
right. But you imagine Rourke caring about her mail?
No.
No.
You know, it was like, oh, I'm sorry. It's like.
But doesn't it make perfect sense? Doesn't it make perfect sense that Dominique is afraid that anything she values will be crushed by the world, that the world is driven by this, this conflict between, she even reflects on this at some point in these chapters, a force of good and a force of bad. And the banner sort of represents the world of the bad, of the crushing. But so she wants to protect what she looks on as great, like Rourke wants to protect them, keep them from going out in the world. I mean, maybe Winans doing something like that with her. The reason he opens her mail, he doesn't want her to accept invitations to be a public person, on committees and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's exactly parallel.
You think it's exactly
How he treats Dominique is how Dominique thinks about Rourke. I think it's exactly parallel.
they actually get to have two mirrors. Who was talking about the reflections was Charles, but it's like they're mirroring each other, and they get to see it like switching hats, which actually in real life makes life a lot easier when you can see something from another perspective, because like instead of being an art maker, you become an art buyer. Well, then you can see it from another perspective really easily.
Mm-hmm.
And,
but also they have it, right, so they locate it someplace else. So they locate the thing that they want most in some other person instead of in themselves. They make another person into what they think they would wish they were.
Right. So in Winan, in that like the very beginning of chapter 8, so he says or not he says, but he didn't hesitate to open her mail, and then she reminds him of something, an editorial in the banner, and he says, "I have never apologized for the banner, and I never will." So we're seeing two characteristics. Opening the mail is scary. It's a little creepy. And then saying, I will not apologize for it. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. He's not talking about truth. He's just saying he will never do it. So you're getting to see that he's going to lock in. It's a little signal that he's locking himself in. He's not.
That's very good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Someone mentioned last discussion that Gale is sort of highly compartmentalized in his behavior. I think that's a good description of it. I was thinking, okay, so what's he makes a point of never meeting anyone who, none of the artists that his book. And I think it might represent that if you have two incongruent ideas in your mind, some people can operate that way.
Right.
And for other people, it's almost like their mind, it's like the UFC for ideas. Like two ideas go in, and then
Right.
they fight until one idea is victorious.
Yeah.
And I think that later in the book, that when Gale starts to blend these two compartments, that he has this relationship with Dominique, and becomes a friendship with Rourke. But it has problems to it. And I think the character represents power and using that power to maybe protect things that are of value. But that is a dangerous configuration.
Yes. Yeah. And it shows up in behavior and action where you're like at 6s and 7s and you're doing one thing and then you're doing another thing, and then and the superiority of integrity, of being consistent all the way down, and is, I think, one of the themes of this book, like a building, you know, as opposed to Gail Winan, who has cornices on one side and the other side he's like, you know, Bauhaus, you know.
There's an interesting point about integrity that comes up. I guess this is actually in the next chapter 9. If you don't mind my jumping ahead, but this is there. Rourke is saying, I'm sorry. Winan says they're on the yacht and he's talking to Dominique. He says, "You know what you're actually in love with? Integrity, the impossible, the clean, consistent, reasonable, self-faithful, the all of one style, like a work of art." That, you know, I think that's a reflection. The interesting thing about the concept of integrity is that, you know, when we think of it in moral terms, we think of it as acting in accordance with your principles. So not being a hypocrite. But integrity also means oneness. It means consistency across, you know, not just between your beliefs and your actions, but between your goals and your values, your alignment with the world and with yourself, which goes beyond, you know, never telling a lie or you know, never breaking a promise or anything like that. And that I think is part and parcel of what, in the sense that this book is about integrity. I think that's an important piece of what Rand's trying to convey.
But I'm glad you brought that up, because how straightforward in terms of that it's only ever possible really in a work of art. I mean, that makes you think. I mean, I don't know. Humans aren't necessarily constantly, although we can work at it, right? We could strive for it. We could have hold that ideal at least. But I'm trying to think if this is something that Winan's saying or something that Rand is saying. That's what I'm trying to figure out. In terms,
I think it's something.
Go ahead,
that Rand is saying it about Winan, because she, in her discussions or lectures or something in real life, says that she's one of her characters, she meaning one of the heroes. So I think he's exempting himself from the responsibility of not being hypocritical.
Okay.
He's saying it only happens in art that it's pure. Like, I don't want to meet the artist because I'm going to find out that they're a drunk when they can make this beautiful thing that I idolize. I don't want to meet them. And so his character is that art's the only place that has this purity. It's not real. It's not in real life.
Yeah, that's like the person who you know, will do all these horrible things, but on Sunday morning he goes to church, and that's an exception. And art for Winan is his church. Okay. Integrity, it's like someone said that consistency is for trains. You know, right. I know who said it, but I'm not going to mention the name. But yeah, someone did say that. So
there's a passage where Winan is talking. He says, "I like to think that I took the worst refuse of the human spirit, the mind of that housewife and the minds of the people that like to read about her, and I made this necklace on your shoulders, and I made of it this necklace on your shoulders. I like to think that I was an alchemist capable of performing so great a purification." Now, his motivation is, we're identifying that he's using the banner and he's not good, you know, it's this kind of corrupt thing that's just following trends. Earlier we got to see like Tui and Folger talking. And their motivation is not to make even a necklace out of it in the end.
Well,
So So Winan tries to destroy people that have integrity and all this stuff. Tui tries to destroy people that have integrity and all this stuff. But they have two different motivations. One is that Winan feels that he can somehow make, it's a purification.
Well, but he also says, all of the giants of the spirit whom I've broken, I don't think anybody ever realized how much I enjoyed doing it. It's a kind of lust. I'm perfectly indifferent to slugs like Ellsworth Tui, but just let me see a man of slightly higher dimension, and I've got to make a sort of Tui out of him. I've got to. It's like a sex urge. So
Now,
that's just
power masochism.
So there's nothing beautiful that's coming out of that. That's just a pure power trip.
Yeah, I think that's about, it's like if you have a DJ deck with all of these variables to someone's personality, and for Gale, like things around power seeking and, being a thug, it's like if you turn those all the way up, but you make someone like really smart and they can appreciate art, but you take away integrity, right? And like, what do you get? And it's like, oh, you get Rupert Murdoch, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think these other characters are, okay, like what if you turn down, force and power seeking, but you maximize seeking approval from others? And it's like you get Peter Keating. And then I think she's taking us on a tour of like, people can seem great, but what's the real standard by which you judge them? And I think that it's a clever illustration of actually refuting that ends justify the means. So I think it's a really, clever illustration of that using a very real life example, which is there are people who own newspapers, and I'm sure they know that like the stuff that's printed in them is like drivel, and why are they okay with that? And there's some justification there, some mental gymnastics where it's like, well, this is what people want to read, or et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And if they weren't comfortable with that, or they weren't willing to make that trade-off with themselves, would they want to spend their time on Earth doing something different? Like, is there something they are passionate about, they do want to create? So I think it's a really clever character, and interesting that was that the thug was like a newspaper owner.
I want to take note of one very interesting little small detail. Is when Winan and Dominique are watching the play. He's talking about mentioned sublime, and it's the first time that I know of Rand ever talking about the sublime, and it's through Winan, and it's as if the author knew the nature of his work, which was the mediocre work, the skin off your nose, knew the nature of his work and boasted of his power to make it appear sublime in the minds of his own, and thus destroy the capacity for the sublime within them. Now, Immanuel Kant, in his critique of judgment, which is his aesthetic body of work as a philosopher, talks about the sublime. And his sublime is that it's all these awful things. It does violence to your imagination. It throttles your methodology. It's anti-craftsmanship. I read it thoroughly. Now, Rand never talked about Kant in any kind of detail other than say he was an evil man. But I'm sure she read it and that a lot of her body of work is an answer to him. But this is the first time she talks about the sublime, and she uses it for that concept that raise mediocrity or crap. You raise the crap, you destroy the sublime capacity. And
well, yeah,
I
it's a notion that one doesn't need to bother with standards. One doesn't need to learn anything. One doesn't need to look at aesthetic standards. They're emasculating aesthetic standards, and this is actually happening, as we know, in the postmodernist movement, where they're basically deconstructing standards, deconstructing language, deconstructing aesthetics completely, and especially literature, to the point where it's absolutely meaningless drivel. And it's very prophetic, written in when 1947 or whatever it was. Very, very prophetic.
Yeah,
it was in the middle of
that's the point. That's the point we should appreciate. I think, you know, a lot with Atlas Shrugged, people say, how could she know in the 1950s when it was published that what the government and the crony system was going to be like today? How could she have said that? But here, there's something very similar that Charles is pointing out. She was incredibly foresightful about where a culture was going on these premises. I think she would have been horrified to see postmodernism, but would not have been in the least surprised.
Right.
So anyway, that's reaffirm Charles's point. I think it's great.
If you follow the logic, is what she would have done. Follow the line of thinking. This is where it will end up. But this also is exactly what Winan does. Is destroy the ability of others with his paper, to recognize the sublime. Now, he might at least know it, but he doesn't have any confidence that anybody else does, and so he still puts that into his paper. His paper is still undermining other people's abilities.
Towards the end of chapter 8, we get Wynand and Dominique talking about their treason. It's the first time that I feel like I'm getting to know Dominique, that she's actually identifying what she's doing and what it really is. Like before, she took for granted that she can just destroy a sculpture and not really think about what does that mean.
What happened?
Anyone there?
Well, the audio.
Where'd the meeting go?
Yeah, I'm still here.
I'm still here. Yeah.
Oh,
get that
okay.
It just short circuit.
Short circuit?
It's back.
Okay.
Well, I share my webcam. There we go.
There
we are.
I see everyone but David. So Marilyn, what were you saying?
Oh no, I was just trying to figure where everyone went. All the pictures disappeared.
So we're talking about their treason at the end of chapter 8. And I just found it very profound and authentic that here are these kind of manipulators, Dominique, that love the good so intensely they just don't want it to exist in a way because they're afraid for it. And they're talking out loud what is really going on.
Well, this goes back to the point Adele made before about why Dominique wants to torture Winan. She sees, if I understood you, Adele, it's that she sees so much of herself in him that torturing him is torturing herself. And here we're getting to what it is that in common. She senses something, this treason.
Yeah, I think that she's putting him through what she herself is going through.
Yeah, it sounds exactly right to me.
I also find I haven't read Dostoevsky in a while, but I was funny. I never read books in high school, and then I got out of high school. I never read anything, but one of the first books I got was Dostoevsky. I just put nothing into him, and I think there's a little bit of an influence here with the networking of what's going on through people's minds. It's all very complicated and hard to keep track of because they're evolving and changing, and it's complex stuff that's filled with contradictions. Yet each person seems to have their unique character. So I think that Rand is doing an amazing job of kind of being like an analyst, a therapist, going into people's minds and having similar.
I would say they each have their own leitmotif.
Yeah. So anyone else? David?
No, I had that same sense, and I remember going, I remember back the first or second time I read it when I was much younger, just saying, it was the second time, because the first time I just inhaled it, but the second time I went through it, I read it slowly, and I said, I have to understand what's going on with these characters, almost sentence by sentence. It became an obsession. And so I know exactly what you're talking about, Michael. And I hadn't thought, but that Dostoevsky is a great kind of point of comparison, with the intricacies of moral psychology, let's call it that.
Moral psychology, yes. So in the last chapter, I think this is really profound. Do you love the heroic in man, Gail? I love to think of it, but I don't believe it. With Dominique, she's already seen it in real life. So she knows it exists. And it's, Marilyn, do you have any thoughts on this last chapter with Dominique?
Well, I think at this point she realizes that she has to go back to Rourke, and she's going to start to make her way. She asks him to fire Ellsworth Toohey, and who has also been her comrade in arms and trying to. And now she realizes that she may have gone too far, and she doesn't want to keep going on doing this. So I think she does want to actually live the life that she thinks she can't live.
So in a way, she's looking at Wyman and saying, "Oh, I can see where he's making a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
He's not putting his pieces together." And then she could see it reflected in her. But what she's doing something different. She's saying, "Okay, well, that means I've got to change," or like, "Let's just."
That's really interesting. Yeah.
And that's setting her up to get towards, well, not to tell the end.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what this.
Well, yeah, she's already said she's in love with them. So you could just imagine that she would want to express that more fully.
Adele?
I think that this chapter was a lot about her realizing that her marriage is in fact a journey of self-discovery. By understanding Wyman, she can understand herself, and then she can realize what she needs to do in order to be ready.
That's beautifully said. That's just perfect. I bet.
Yeah.
Put plans on her.
I'm glad we recorded that. Yeah. I the same thought. Thanks, Adele.
That's just perfect. Well, I think we have to wrap it up. It's 1:02, and those chapters were intense. It's too bad, like we didn't get to spend much time on the last one. But thank you all for joining. And
thank you, everyone.
Okay, I will off the recording now.
Great conversation, everybody. Thanks.
Yeah.